Most people today carry a quiet assumption that life can change. Even if you are born into financial hardship, there is an underlying belief that movement is possible. You can relocate, you can change direction, you can learn something new and start over. You can leave a place that no longer serves you and build something different somewhere else. That belief feels so natural now that it is easy to take for granted. It shapes how people make decisions, how they raise children, and how they understand failure. The possibility of change is woven into the way modern life is organized, in education systems, in labor markets, in the stories cultures tell about themselves. But for most of human history, that assumption did not exist. If you were born poor in the Middle Ages, your future would not open before you as a field of possibility. It would arrive as a fixed inheritance. Your family's position would determine your legal standing, your occupation, your obligations, and the land you were permitted to work. The question was not what you might become. The question was whether you would survive long enough to fulfill the role you were already born into. Mobility was not expected. Reinvention was rare. Survival was the central concern. Tonight, as fields stretch outward in the quiet rhythm of a Minecraft world, imagine your life beginning in a small medieval village. Not as a knight, not as a nobleman, but as one of the many. Because the vast majority of people were not powerful. They were poor. And if you were born among them, your story would follow a very different path. You are born in a single-room home, built from timber frames, packed with mud and straw. The floor is bare earth. The roof is thatched, layered with dried reeds or long grass pressed tight against the rafters. Smoke from the central hearth drifts upward, but never fully escapes. By midwinter, the walls and ceiling are darkened by years of accumulated soot. The air smells of ash, damp wood, and livestock. There are no separate bedrooms, no clean linens, no sterile instruments. The animals, a pig, perhaps some chickens, occasionally a cow, may share the same structure during the coldest months, their warmth considered a practical benefit rather than an inconvenience. Your home is one room. Your family sleeps together. Your world, from the first breath you take, is small and close and dense. A local midwife assists your mother. Her knowledge comes from experience and passed down tradition, not formal medical training. There is no understanding of infection in any modern sense. Wounds are dressed with what is available. Prayers are offered alongside remedies. Survival depends on resilience and circumstance. Infant mortality is common. Many children do not live beyond their first years. Disease spreads easily in close quarters. Malnutrition weakens immune systems. A simple fever can turn fatal. The family may have already lost children before you. They may lose children after. If you survive infancy, you have already passed through one of the most dangerous thresholds of medieval life. Within days of your birth, you are baptized. Religion shapes your identity from the very beginning. Baptism is not merely ceremonial. It is understood to carry eternal significance. An unbaptized child exists in a category of spiritual uncertainty that the church takes seriously. Getting you to the font quickly is not a formality. It is understood as necessary. The church is not a distant institution. It is woven into daily reality in ways that have no modern equivalent. There is no separation between religious life and ordinary life. They are the same life. Your family does not celebrate your birth with long-term plans or ambitions. They help you survive. You do not grow up thinking about what you want to become. You grow up learning what you already are. By age 5 or 6, you begin contributing to the household, not as a gesture or a lesson, but as a genuine economic necessity. You gather firewood from the forest edges, you fetch water from a communal well or nearby stream, carrying it in buckets or clay vessels. You watch over chickens or geese, keeping them near home and away from predators. You scare birds away from ripening crops by walking the field rows and clapping or shouting. None of this is play. It is work, and it begins early because it must. There is no formal schooling available to you. Literacy among the rural poor is rare. The ability to read and write is not considered a practical skill for peasant children. It is a tool of clergy, administration, and commerce, none of which are paths open to you. Education, where it exists at all, is tied to the church or to urban institutions, and largely unreachable for peasant families. You learn by watching. You observe your parents work the fields and you memorize what you see. You absorb the timing of planting and harvest. When the soil is ready, when the frost is still a danger, when the grain is dry enough to cut. You learn how to repair fences, patch thatch before rain damages it, care for animals through illness, and preserve food so that it survives the months when nothing new is growing. This knowledge is real and it is deep. It has been accumulated across generations and refined through long experience. It simply cannot be written down or transferred anywhere else. It lives in the habits and hands of people who have never left this land. Your world is small. Most people travel no more than a few miles from the place they were born. The boundaries of your life are defined not by ambition, but by geography. The next village feels distant. A town feels like another world. News from cities arrives slowly, carried by merchants or wandering travelers, weeks or months after the events that prompted it. Time is not measured by clocks. It is measured by seasons and church bells. The bells of your parish church mark canonical hours, the fixed times of prayer that structure every day. Prime at dawn, terce at mid-morning, sext at midday. None in the afternoon, vespers at dusk, compline before sleep. These rhythms do not feel imposed. They feel like the natural shape of a day. Spring brings plowing, summer brings tending and repair, autumn brings harvest, winter brings endurance. This cycle repeats year after year, shaping your sense of what is normal before you are old enough to question it. You do not experience the seasons as something that happens around your life. You experience them as the substance of your life itself. If you are born poor in much of medieval Europe, you likely belong to a manorial estate. The manor is not just a building. It is an economic system, and it governs nearly everything about your daily existence. At its center stands the Lord's residence, a fortified manor house or small castle. Surrounding it are fields divided into long strips, allocated among the village households. Beyond those fields are forests, meadows, and shared grazing land that the community uses collectively. Your family does not own the land you farm. You work it in exchange for protection and the right to remain. That exchange is not negotiated. It was inherited, generation by generation, going back further than anyone in your village can remember. If you are a serf, and in many parts of medieval Europe, you are legally bound to this land. You cannot leave freely. You cannot take a position in another lord's territory without permission. Your legal identity is tied to the estate the way a tree is tied to the soil beneath it. You belong to this place in a way that the modern mind finds difficult to fully comprehend. You owe labor services to the Lord. Several days each week your family works his fields rather than your own. These are called boon days or week work, and they are not optional. They come before your own needs. You also owe a portion of your crops as rent. After harvest, the Lord's share is set aside first. And the church claims a tithe, typically 1/10 of your yield paid to the parish. After these obligations are met, what remains must sustain your household through the year. In a good year, there is enough. In a difficult one, that margin disappears. This system is not chaotic. It is structured and broadly accepted. Lords provide security during conflict, resolution in local disputes, and infrastructure such as the mill where your grain is ground. Peasants provide the labor that makes agricultural production possible. The church frames this arrangement as a natural order, even divinely ordained. From your perspective, inequality is not presented as injustice. It is presented as stability. The priest explains that God has arranged the world into estates for a reason. Those who pray serve the spiritual needs of all. Those who fight protect the community. Those who labor feed everyone. Each role is necessary. Each role is honorable. To wish for a different position is not ambition. It is a failure to understand the order of things. You absorb this framing not as propaganda, but as obvious truth. You have never seen anything that contradicts it. Let us move slowly through 1 year, because the year is the primary unit by which a medieval peasant's life is organized. Spring arrives. The ground softens after winter frost. Oxen are harnessed to heavy plows that open the earth into long, straight furrows. You walk behind the plow, guiding the blade, watching the dark soil turn over. Seeds, rye, wheat, barley, oats, depending on the region, are pressed into the ground by hand or by foot. Every seed matters. Every row must be even. This is exhausting work, and it is only the beginning of months of physical labor. Between plowing and planting, Drainage ditches must be cleared of winter debris. Hedgerows need trimming. The Lord's fields must receive attention before your own can. Summer follows. The growing season demands constant attention. Crops must be maintained. Weeds pulled before they compete with grain. Fences repaired to keep animals out of cultivated areas. Livestock monitored across shared grazing lands. Storms can flatten entire fields. Drought can stunt growth across a full season. A hailstorm arriving at the wrong moment can destroy weeks of labor in minutes. You rise before sunrise and work until dusk. Your back aches. Your hands are rough. You do not think of this as suffering. You think of it as summer. Haymaking in June and July is a communal effort. Entire households work together cutting, turning, and stacking hay that will feed animals through winter. There is a social dimension to this. Neighbors working side by side, sharing food and water, occasionally singing. But it is not primarily social. It is survival. Autumn brings harvest. This is the most critical moment of the year. The entire year of labor culminates in these weeks. Crops must be gathered before frost or sustained rain destroys them. Timing is everything, and you watch the weather with an intensity that is impossible to separate from anxiety. Entire families work side by side, men, women, and children, cutting grain with sickles, bundling sheaves, carrying them back to threshing floors. The work does not pause for exhaustion. Part of this harvest goes to the Lord. His portion is measured and collected before anything else. Part goes to the church. The tithe collector arrives and takes his share. A portion must be kept as seed grain for the following year. This is not optional. Without it, there is no next year. What remains determines whether your family eats comfortably through winter or rations carefully until spring. Winter arrives. The fields lie dormant under frost. Agricultural work stops, but life does not slow completely. Tools are repaired, handles replaced, blades resharpened, harnesses mended. Animals are sheltered in outbuildings or, in the coldest climates, brought close to human dwellings. Food stores are monitored with increasing attention as weeks turn to months. The difficult stretch often comes in late winter. This is sometimes called the hungry gap. The period after stored grain begins running low, and the next harvest is still months away. Portions become smaller, bread becomes coarser, children grow quieter. Hunger in this season is not dramatic. It is gradual and familiar, a recurring reality rather than a crisis. But it weakens bodies, lowers resistance to illness, and creates a chronic low-level fragility that marks every winter of your life. And through it all, the bells ring, the seasons turn. The year ends and begins again. Your meals are simple and repetitive throughout every season. Bread made from rye or barley forms the foundation of your diet. It is coarse and dense, sometimes mixed with husks or ground legumes to stretch the grain further. During lean years, other materials find their way in. The bread is nothing like what bread means today. It is fuel. Pottage fills the bowl most evenings. This is a thick stew made from whatever is available. Grains, dried peas, beans, cabbage, onions, turnips, leeks. The pot is kept going, with new ingredients added as old ones are consumed. In a good season, it is thick and varied. In a poor one, it is thin and monotonous. Cheese and eggs appear when animals are producing them. Salted fish may be available in regions with trade access to coastal areas, particularly important during the many fasting days the church requires throughout the year. Meat is rare. It appears during religious festivals, or when an animal reaches the end of its useful life and must be slaughtered before winter rather than fed through the cold months. The slaughter of a pig in autumn is an event, a moment of unusual abundance in an otherwise modest diet. You drink ale throughout the day, including with meals. It is often weak in alcohol but calorie-dense and more reliably safe than water drawn from sources near human habitation. Children drink it too. Water, depending on your source, can carry illness that neither you nor anyone around you understands. You do not eat for variety or pleasure in any way that resembles a modern relationship with food. You eat for strength, you eat to be capable of work tomorrow. A failed harvest means rationing begins immediately. A severe failure extended across multiple seasons means some people do not survive the winter. Agricultural societies are fragile in this way. Without modern transport or preservation methods, a difficult year in one region cannot easily be offset by importing supplies from another. Your survival is tied directly to what grows within walking distance of your home. The weather over your fields is not a background condition. It is the most important force in your life. Injury carries serious consequences in a world without modern medicine. A cut from a farming tool can become infected. There are no antibiotics. An infection that would be cleared in days today can travel through a body unchecked, causing fever, swelling, and death within weeks. People understand that wounds are dangerous. They do not understand why. Medical understanding is constrained by inherited classical theory. The dominant framework holds that health depends on the balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Treatment involves adjusting that balance through diet, rest, or intervention. Bloodletting, the deliberate removal of blood through cutting or leeches, is considered a legitimate and useful practice. Some herbal remedies provide genuine relief. Willow bark contains compounds related to aspirin. Certain plants have antimicrobial properties that practitioners discover through observation rather than chemistry. Local healers carry real knowledge built across generations. But there is no systematic framework to distinguish what works from what doesn't, and no way to address the infections, the fevers, or the internal failures that kill most often. Broken bones may heal poorly or not at all, leaving permanent disability. A laborer who cannot work fully is a burden to a household with no safety margins. Childbirth remains one of the most dangerous experiences in a woman's life. Complications that are manageable with modern obstetric care become fatal without it. Many women die in childbirth. Many more die from infections that follow. Every pregnancy carries genuine risk, and that risk is understood and accepted as a condition of life. Life expectancy averages are low primarily because childhood mortality is high. Those numbers can be misleading. If you survive into adulthood, past the dangerous early years, you may live into your 40s or 50s, but your body will carry the accumulated weight of decades of physical labor. Arthritis, worn joints, chronic back pain, and deteriorating eyesight are ordinary features of middle age, not exceptional complaints. There is no safety net beyond family and community. If you cannot work, you depend on others. If you have no family and the community cannot sustain you, you have very little to fall back on. The fragility is total in a way that modern social structures, for all their imperfections, have genuinely reduced. Religion structures your understanding of hardship in ways that are difficult to fully separate from every other aspect of life. Church bells mark the hours. Sundays bring Mass, which is not optional and not merely spiritual. It is a communal gathering that serves social and informational functions alongside the religious ones. Holy days interrupt labor and offer brief celebration. The church calendar is the calendar. The rhythm of the year is defined by feast days and fast days, by Advent and Lent, by the feasts of saints whose names mark the turning of seasons. Sermons explain the social order. Kings rule by divine authority. Lords govern by established hierarchy. Peasants fulfill necessary roles. This is not presented as a human arrangement that could be otherwise. It is presented as the shape of things ordained by God. This framework reinforces stability, and it also provides comfort. Suffering in this life is understood to carry spiritual significance. Hardship endured with patience and faith is not merely painful. It is meaningful. It is preparation. The promise of justice in the next life absorbs questions that might otherwise become destabilizing in this one. The church building itself is often the most impressive structure you regularly enter. In a village of low timber houses with earthen floors, the church stands in stone. Walls 2 feet thick. Small windows that filter light into something colored and sacred. Carved details on the doorway. A tower that can be seen from a distance. Inside, images tell stories. Painted walls, carved figures, stained glass where wealth permits, all depicting the biblical narratives and the lives of saints that form the framework of meaning for your entire community. You cannot read the Bible, but you can see it. Compared to your home, the church feels vast and permanent. In a world of fragile wooden houses that burn, rot, and must be rebuilt within a generation, stone symbolizes endurance. The church will still be standing when your grandchildren's grandchildren are gone. That permanence is not incidental. It is the point. By adolescence, your path is already visible. You are not choosing your future. You are continuing one that was set before you arrived in it. But history is never completely still. Even within rigid systems, pressure builds over time. And the world you have been born into is beneath its surface, beginning to accumulate the tensions that will eventually change it. The rhythm of your life feels predictable. Plant, tend, harvest, endure winter, begin again, but predictability does not mean security. In an agricultural world, stability rests on fragile foundations. A few weeks of unusual weather can undo an entire year of labor. When survival depends almost entirely on crops grown within walking distance, the margin for error is narrow. There is no buffer. There is no reserve deep enough to carry a community through more than one difficult year. For most of your life, hunger would not be dramatic. It would be gradual. A tightening of portions, a thinning of meals, a quiet adaptation to less. And then, occasionally, it would become something far worse. Imagine a year when the spring rains do not stop. Fields become waterlogged. Seeds rot before they sprout. Oxen struggle through mud that pulls at every step. By summer, the crops that did manage to germinate are thin and uneven, pale where they should be green, leaning where they should stand upright. You still work every day. You still follow the same motions because there is no alternative to following them. But you can see the difference. The grain heads are smaller than last year. The yield will not be sufficient. By autumn, the numbers are clear even without arithmetic. The harvest is poor, the stores will be thin. The Lord still expects his share. The church still expects its tithe. Obligations do not adjust when harvests fail. They are fixed. The flexibility, such as it exists, is absorbed entirely by the peasant household. Your family reduces portions quietly. There is no announcement or discussion. Everyone understands. Meals become thinner. Pottage holds more water and fewer vegetables. Bread is divided more carefully than usual. Winter stretches long. Then spring returns. But the stores are nearly empty. This period before the next harvest, sometimes called the hungry season, becomes genuinely dangerous. Malnutrition weakens bodies that are already carrying the strain of winter. Illness moves through a population already under stress. Children and the elderly are most vulnerable. If neighboring villages experience the same failure, there is little external relief to draw from. There is no mechanism to move food from regions with surplus to regions with shortage, not at any meaningful scale or speed. The Great Famine of the early 14th century illustrated how vulnerable medieval Europe was to sustained agricultural collapse. Beginning around 1315, years of heavy rain destroyed harvests across wide regions of northern Europe. Food prices rose sharply. Livestock died from disease alongside failing crops. Communities consumed seed grain meant for the following year's planting, which deepened the crisis the year after. Mortality was significant in affected areas, though it varied considerably by region. For someone born poor, famine is not a distant historical event. It is a possibility woven into every growing season. It is the worst version of what is always already partially true about your life. To understand why famine was so damaging, it helps to consider how food production actually worked. Medieval agriculture was reasonably efficient by the standards of its time. Farmers understood their land, their crops, and their climate through generations of accumulated observation. But yields were low compared to modern farming. A significant portion of each harvest had to be held back as seed grain for the following year, reducing the usable surplus substantially. Crop rotation systems, particularly the three-field method, which divided arable land into segments planted with winter grain, spring grain, and left fallow in rotation, improved soil management and reduced the exhaustion of the land. But even well-managed fields could not produce enough to absorb a serious weather failure. Transportation infrastructure was poor by any modern standard. Roads were unpaved tracks that became difficult to navigate in wet seasons. Moving large quantities of grain overland was expensive and slow. River transport was more practical but still limited in reach. There was no global supply chain. There was no national reserve. There was barely a regional one. If your local harvest failed and neighboring regions experienced the same weather, scarcity intensified quickly with nothing to interrupt it. In this world, food security is not a policy discussion. It is a daily calculation made against uncertain odds. Malnutrition reduces resistance to disease in ways that compound one another. Minor infections that a well-nourished body might resist become serious. Respiratory illness spreads through cramped winter homes more easily when immune systems are already taxed. Without modern sanitation, water sources contaminated by animal or human waste can transmit illness invisibly. Medical knowledge in the village remains constrained by inherited classical theory. The framework of balancing bodily humors leads to treatments such as bloodletting, which at best do nothing and at worst accelerate decline in already weakened patients. Some herbal remedies genuinely help. Local healers carry real practical knowledge, but there is no systematic understanding of how disease moves through a population or what stops it. Hospitals exist in some cities, often attached to religious institutions, but they function more as places of shelter and prayer than centers of medical treatment. In villages, care depends on family members, local healers, and the prayers of the parish. Illness is understood through faith, tradition, and personal experience. You interpret a fever as something God permits, something that carries meaning, something to be endured and survived or not. You do not think about pathogens. You have no framework for that concept. Recovery is slow and uncertain, and then something arrives that no one, not the learned physicians in city universities, not the bishops, not the kings, fully understands. In the mid-14th century, plague spreads across Europe. It travels along trade routes, moving from port cities into inland towns, and then into villages like yours. The disease that historians will later call the Black Death advances faster than news of it. Symptoms appear rapidly: fever, painful swellings in the groin and armpits and neck, internal hemorrhaging that darkens the skin. Some die within days of the first sign. Others linger for a week. Communities that had already endured years of famine are especially vulnerable. Bodies weakened by insufficient nutrition have fewer resources for any kind of resistance. The plague does not observe social hierarchy. It enters merchant households and noble estates as readily as it enters peasant homes. But those in poverty suffer acutely because they live in closer quarters, share fewer resources, and have no capacity to isolate from infected neighbors. Entire households disappear within days. Fields go unharvested in some areas because there are not enough surviving workers to bring in the crops. Animals go untended. Routines that had structured daily life for generations simply stop because the people who maintain them are gone. In the worst affected regions, populations decline by a third or more within a few years. The exact numbers remain debated by historians, but the scale of mortality was unlike anything in living memory. For someone born poor, this is not abstract history. It is neighbors vanishing. It is empty houses across the lane that no one enters because no one knows how the illness spreads. It is uncertainty layered on top of hardship, on top of more hardship. The psychological weight is immense. The church's explanations, divine punishment, the need for repentance, offer a framework for grief, but not a solution. Faith is tested. Social structures strain. Some communities turn on outsiders. Some people abandon obligation entirely. Others respond with intensified devotion, with flagellant processions, and urgent prayer. But within the tragedy, something unexpected begins to shift. Before the plague, labor was abundant. Peasants competed for limited land. Lords held strong negotiating positions. Obligations were fixed and enforced. A serf who attempted to leave was pursued and returned. After the plague, the balance changes. Not everywhere, not immediately, not without considerable conflict, but meaningfully. There are fewer workers available to cultivate land. Fields lie abandoned that were productive before. Lords need laborers more urgently than they have in generations. In some areas, surviving peasants begin to negotiate better terms. Wages rise for hired labor. Authorities, kings, lords, town councils attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, recognizing the threat the shift poses to established order. The Statute of Laborers in England, passed in 1351, tried to enforce exactly this. But enforcement was uneven and contested. Mobility increases in certain regions as workers move toward better opportunities. Some lords competing for labor offer reduced obligations or longer leases to attract and retain peasants. The permanence that had defined the serf's position begins, in some places and for some people, to soften. Serfdom does not vanish. Hierarchies remain largely intact. But cracks appear in what once seemed permanent, and those cracks matter. If you were born poor before the plague, your childhood likely followed a rigid path. with little room to deviate. If you were born in the decades after, you might find slightly more flexibility in your options. Not freedom in any modern sense, but a small increase in the range of possible choices. That small increase is not nothing. In a world where almost nothing was negotiable before, anything negotiable is significant. For generations, the three-estate model had been not just a description, but a definition of reality. Those who pray, the clergy, serve the spiritual needs of all. Those who fight, the nobility, protect the community. Those who labor, the peasantry, sustain everyone through the work of their hands. Most people born into this world do not grow up imagining that it could be arranged differently. The system defines what is real, and most people's imaginations do not venture past what they have been raised to believe is real. But when crisis disrupts labor markets and shifts social expectations, alternatives become visible in ways they were not before. If a neighboring peasant successfully negotiates higher wages and returns to Tel Aviv, you hear. If a runaway serf escapes to a town and is never retrieved because the Lord cannot spare the effort, you hear that too. If a lord's fields lie fallow because he cannot compel sufficient labor, you see the change with your own eyes. Ideas spread slowly in a world without printing, without widespread literacy, without any of the mechanisms that accelerate the movement of information today. But they do spread. In markets, in taverns, in churches, through the conversations of travelers and peddlers. Even in a world defined by repetition and tradition, events can accelerate transformation. The plague accelerated things that had been building slowly for a long time. At some point in your life, you begin to wonder whether remaining in the village is your only path. Perhaps your family has struggled through several poor harvests in a row. Perhaps tensions between your household and a neighboring one have made daily life difficult. Perhaps the obligations owed to the Lord feel increasingly unjust in ways that are harder to ignore now that you have heard stories of places where people live differently. Perhaps you simply want something the village cannot offer, without being able to name what that something is. Stories circulate about towns and cities, markets where goods from distant regions change hands, workshops producing cloth, tools, metalwork, leather goods, wages earned in coin rather than labor surrendered to an obligation you did not choose. The idea that a person might change what they do based on what they are good at rather than what they were born into. There is a phrase that spreads through certain parts of medieval Europe. City air makes you free. It reflects a legal reality in certain regions. If a serf escaped to a chartered town and lived there openly for a year and a day without being reclaimed by a lord, they could gain legal freedom. The town's charter protected them. This was not universal across all of Europe, and enforcement varied considerably. But the principle existed and was known. To leave is risky in ways that must be understood clearly. You must travel without protection through roads that can be unsafe. Bandits operate in some regions. You may be recognized and reported. If caught and returned before the year and a day are complete, consequences can be severe. You arrive in a city with no guaranteed employment, no existing relationships, no place to sleep, and no reputation that will get your foot in any door. But remaining in the village guarantees only the continuation of what already exists. Leaving, at minimum, offers the possibility that something might be different. Imagine walking through a city gate for the first time. The transition is immediate and total. Narrow streets wind between multi-story timber buildings whose upper floors lean out over the roadway, closing the sky to a pale strip above. The buildings are packed close together. Every horizontal surface not given to structures is occupied by something. Market stalls, carts, animals being led to slaughter, children running errands, workers carrying loads. The noise is continuous, hammering from a blacksmith's workshop, the calls of vendors announcing their goods, church bells overhead, cartwheels on stone cobbles where the road is paved, dogs barking. Somewhere, a crowd gathered around a public announcement. The smells are layered and complex. Bread from ovens vented into the street. Smoke from fires that never entirely stop. The waste of thousands of people and animals concentrated in narrow spaces. With limited drainage, unlike the quiet rhythm of fields, the city hums without pause, even at night. You are not the only newcomer. Rural migrants arrive regularly, drawn by trade and the possibility of wages. You can see it in their clothing, in the way they stand still for a moment at the gate and look. The city absorbs them. It absorbed the ones before them. It will absorb the ones after. You search for work because without work, there is nothing else. Urban poverty differs from rural poverty in ways that matter. In the countryside, your life is tied to land and inherited obligation. You know where you will sleep. You know what you will eat, more or less. You know what is expected of you. In the city, your survival depends entirely on wages, and wages are not guaranteed. Each morning, laborers gather at recognized locations, near construction sites, at dockside, outside workshops and warehouses, where employers seek workers for the day. This is casual labor. There is no contract and no security. If chosen, you earn coin for the day's work. If not chosen, you find alternatives or go without. Work available to an unskilled migrant includes hauling stone for construction, carrying water to households that pay for delivery, unloading cargo from carts and barges, cleaning stables, digging foundations, and any other physical task that requires bodies rather than skills. The work is physically demanding and the pay is modest, but the pay is in coin, and coin changes the relationship between you and your survival in subtle but real ways. With coin, you can buy food from a market vendor rather than growing it yourself. You can pay rent to a landlord in money rather than in labor days. You can accumulate small amounts of savings in a way that was nearly impossible on a manorial estate. But wages fluctuate based on economic conditions in ways that harvests, for all their uncertainty, do not. After the plague, labor scarcity pushed wages upward in many areas. As populations recovered over the following century, competition for work increased and wages fell. Urban poverty is tied to markets rather than seasons. Instead of weather alone determining your survival, economic demand now plays an equal role. Housing in the city is cramped and expensive relative to what you earn. You might share a single room with multiple unrelated individuals, each paying a portion of the rent to a landlord who owns the building. Privacy is minimal, noise is constant. The fire in the hearth serves cooking and warmth, but also represents genuine risk. Urban fires spread quickly through closely packed timber structures and can consume entire neighborhoods. Disease moves quickly through dense urban populations. Contaminated water sources, proximity to waste, and contact with large numbers of people from various regions all increase exposure to illness. Cities have higher mortality rates than rural areas in many periods, particularly from epidemic disease. Yet the city offers something genuinely uncommon in medieval life: occupational variety. You can apprentice in a trade if someone will take you on. Blacksmithing, weaving, baking, carpentry, shoemaking, glassblowing, painting. The city contains dozens of trades, each organized under guild structures that regulate membership, standards, and pricing. If you are fortunate enough to secure an apprenticeship, the path begins to look different. An apprenticeship typically requires a fee paid by your family or secured through a sponsor. For someone born poor with nothing to offer, that fee is a genuine obstacle. But it is not an absolute barrier. Some masters take on promising apprentices under informal arrangements, and some guilds have provisions for exceptional cases. An apprenticeship lasts several years, sometimes as many as 7. During this period, you live in your master's household. You work in the shop, learning the trade through observation, repetition, and gradual increases in responsibility. You receive food, lodging, and basic clothing as part of the arrangement. Wages are minimal or non-existent in the early years. The work is demanding. Standards are strict because the guild's reputation depends on the quality of every member's output. A weaver whose cloth falls apart, a baker whose bread is underweight, a blacksmith whose work fails. These failures reflect on the guild as a whole and are regulated accordingly. If you complete the apprenticeship successfully, you become a journeyman. You can now earn wages practicing your trade, working for a master rather than learning from one. You have a skill. You have a reputation within your craft. You have something that can be sold. Eventually, if you accumulate enough savings and can produce a piece of work that demonstrates mastery, the masterpiece that gives the word its origin, you may petition the guild for the right to become a master yourself, to open your own workshop, to take your own apprentices. That is the path upward. It is structured and it is narrow. Most apprentices do not become masters. Capital requirements are high. Guild membership can be selective, favoring those with existing connections, family ties to the trade, or sufficient resources. The system rewards persistence and skill but is not blind to other forms of advantage. But compared to rural serfdom, this is a system where expertise can, under the right conditions, and with enough time and effort, change your standing in the world. Even with steady work in the city, life remains modest in ways that are important to hold clearly. Urban housing is dense, buildings share walls, upper stories overhang narrow streets. Waste disposal systems are limited. Waste is collected and removed, but slowly and imperfectly. Water quality depends on the distance between your source and any source of contamination. Rent consumes a substantial portion of wages. There is little room for savings after food and housing are covered. If illness strikes, wages stop immediately, and without savings, vulnerability returns within days. Food options in the city are more varied than in a rural village. Markets offer fish, bread, prepared foods, vegetables, and occasionally goods brought from distant regions. But prices fluctuate with supply and with season. A poor harvest in the surrounding countryside raises food prices in the city. Economic disruptions that you have no role in creating directly affect what you can afford to eat. Urban life opens certain possibilities. It does not eliminate vulnerability. It changes its character. Marriage among the poor, in both city and countryside, is rarely impulsive or romantic in the modern sense. In both settings, people tend to wait until they can support a household before marrying. This often means waiting until the mid-20s or later than is sometimes assumed about medieval practice. You cannot afford to marry before you can afford to feed children. Dowries exist even among the poor, though they are modest. A daughter might bring bedding, a few household items, some small sum of coin, or an arrangement between families about tools or livestock. A son might be expected to demonstrate some occupational stability before a match is agreed. Marriage is practical. It is an economic partnership as much as a personal bond. Two people working together can maintain a household more efficiently than one. Two incomes in a city environment offer slightly more stability than one. If you are a craftsman, your spouse may assist in the workshop, preparing materials, managing customers, keeping accounts. Women's labor in medieval craft households is extensive and largely uncredited in official records, but genuinely essential to operation. If you are a day laborer, your spouse may take in laundry, brew ale for sale, spin thread, or sell small goods at market. Children are expected. They represent both continuity and economic contribution. From early ages, children take on household tasks. In a craftsman's household, children begin assisting in the workshop by their early teens. In a laboring household, they contribute whatever physical help their size and strength allow. But every child also carries risk. Infant mortality remains high even in urban environments where some resources are more available. Losing children is tragically common. Grief becomes part of the ordinary texture of life, processed within a religious framework that gives it meaning but does not reduce its weight. Now imagine your life over decades. You work steadily through your prime years, you marry, you raise children, you survive illness and recover from injury, though the recovery takes longer each time. You pay rent, you maintain your reputation within the network of relationships that gives you access to work and credit and community. Can you accumulate wealth? Possibly, but slowly, and only under favorable conditions. Medieval economies do not offer rapid upward mobility for most people. Without significant inheritance, meaningful capital accumulation is difficult. Tools are expensive to purchase and require ongoing maintenance. Property, even rental property, is largely controlled by established families. Guild membership restricts entry into the most profitable trades. If you are a wage laborer without a specialized skill, the path upward is extremely narrow. The most realistic outcome is stability. Enough to eat, enough to keep a roof over the family, enough to survive illness without immediate destitution. If you secure a trade and manage to save over years of careful living, your children may inherit tools or workshop space or a small amount of coin. That inheritance can shift their starting position slightly. It may make their apprenticeship easier to arrange, their early adult years less precarious. But if you remain unskilled, working casual labor as you arrived, your children likely begin in similar circumstances to the ones you began in. This is how poverty persists across generations. Not because individuals lack effort or intelligence or care, but because structural barriers limit acceleration in ways that individual effort alone cannot overcome. Capital requires capital to build. Connections require existing connections to establish. The children of the poor begin without the things that make beginnings easier. Despite these structural limits, medieval communities are not collections of isolated individuals competing alone. Guilds provide practical support for members in genuine need. When a guild member dies, the guild may assist the widow and children. When a member becomes ill and cannot work, the guild may provide some support during recovery. These are not generous institutions by modern standards, but they represent a form of mutual obligation that cushions individual misfortune. Parishes distribute charity to the genuinely destitute, those without family, without guild membership, without any other recourse. This too is limited and conditional, but it exists. Neighbors share information. Word of available work spreads through informal networks. A craftsman who needs an assistant asks his neighbors before looking elsewhere. A merchant who needs reliable help asks among people whose reliability is already known to someone he trusts. Reputation carries real economic weight. If you are known as reliable, skilled, sober, and honest in your dealings, employers seek you out, landlords extend credit, fellow workers recommend you. The network of trust that surrounds a person with good reputation functions as a genuine resource. If you are known for debt, disorder, or dishonesty, doors close. Work becomes harder to find. The informal credit that allows people to manage the gaps between wages dries up. This dynamic allows some upward movement for those who navigate relationships carefully and maintain their standing over time. But the change remains incremental rather than transformative. What does it feel like to live within these boundaries? It does not feel constantly tragic. People who have never known anything different do not experience it as deprivation in the way an outside observer might assume. It feels structured, normal, correct. You wake at dawn because that is when you wake. You work because work is what the day is. You eat what is available because availability is not a choice. You attend church because that is what the day of the week requires. You rest when the day ends because rest is what the darkness is for. There are festivals, moments in the calendar when labor stops and community gathers. Saints' days celebrated with food and music and games. Seasonal celebrations layered over older agricultural rhythms. Market days that bring people from surrounding villages into a temporary common space full of color, conversation, and goods from elsewhere. There is laughter in taverns after the day's work. There are stories told by firelight in winter. There is music, songs that belong to the region, to the season, to the specific community that sings them. There is the pleasure of skilled work done well, of a harvest brought in before the rain, of a child who survives the dangerous first years. Life contains joy alongside hardship. The two are not cleanly separable. The difference between medieval poverty and modern poverty is not primarily the absence of emotion or community. Medieval poor people loved their children. They laughed with their neighbors. They grieved their losses and celebrated their achievements. The difference is the absence of institutional mobility, the absence of mechanisms by which effort and talent can translate into fundamentally different circumstances. The absence of the assumption that tomorrow could be structurally different from today. You do not grow up expecting to become wealthy. You grow up expecting continuity, and that expectation shapes ambition itself, not by making you passive or incapable, but by directing your energy toward mastery within your existing conditions rather than transformation of them. If you survive into your 40s or 50s, your body reflects the accumulated cost of decades of physical labor. Arthritis in the hands and knees is common among agricultural workers and craftspeople whose work is repetitive and physically demanding. Worn joints, chronic pain in the back, which bears the weight of years of bending, lifting, and carrying. Deteriorating eyesight that makes fine work difficult. Teeth worn down or lost, affecting diet and digestion. If you own a workshop, you may be able to transition into lighter supervisory work, directing apprentices, managing materials, maintaining the relationships that keep the business operating. The skills accumulated over a lifetime retain value even as physical capacity declines. If you are a laborer, dependent on daily physical output for your income, the decline of physical capacity is a direct economic problem. You rely increasingly on your children for support. The expectation that children will care for aging parents is not sentiment. It is the social contract that replaces any formal system of elder support. There is no retirement in any modern sense. There is no pension, no accumulated savings sufficient to live on, no institutional support specifically for the aged. You work until you cannot, and then you depend on whoever will take that responsibility. Old age is respected within its communities. Elders carry knowledge and authority. Their experience is valued, but their material position is precarious in ways that respect does not resolve. If you are widowed and without children in your old age, the parish and neighboring community may provide some support, but there is no guarantee, and the support is minimal. If you had remained in the countryside, your life would have been more predictable, but less flexible. The rhythms of the agricultural year would have continued to define every day. The obligations to Lord and Church would have remained fixed. Your legal status might have softened somewhat in the later medieval period, as serfdom declined in parts of Western Europe, but the fundamental structure of rural life would have changed slowly. If you moved to the city, you gained some agency but accepted a different kind of vulnerability. Urban freedom is real, but fragile. It depends on continuous employment in a market that does not care about your well-being, on maintaining health when disease moves quickly through dense populations, on building reputation and connections in an environment where you began with neither. Neither path guarantees prosperity. Both offer survival within different constraints. Over time, however, urban environments contribute to the broader structural shifts that slowly change what society looks like. Commerce expands, banking practices evolve, bills of exchange, credit instruments, partnerships with defined terms, legal systems develop to regulate contracts and wages and property rights in more sophisticated ways. Political power gradually shifts as cities gain economic importance and leverage. These developments unfold over generations. If you were born poor, you may not live to see the full transformation, but your labor, your daily contribution to the workshop, the construction site, the trade network, contributes to it. By the late Middle Ages, the rigid structures of early feudalism began to soften in many regions of Europe. In earlier centuries, land defined power completely. A lord's wealth and status came almost entirely from agricultural output and the labor of those bound to his estate. Peasants were tied to that land. Legal identity was geography. Over time, following repeated demographic shocks from famine and plague that disrupted labor supplies, the system begins to adapt. Lords increasingly offer land on lease rather than insisting on direct labor services. Cash rents replace some traditional obligations. The relationship between lord and peasant becomes, in some places, slightly more contractual than it had been. This transition is deeply uneven. In some regions of Eastern Europe, serfdom actually intensified in the later medieval period as landlords responded to labor shortages differently, by binding peasants more firmly rather than negotiating with them. The story of the later Middle Ages is not a uniform march toward freedom. It is a complicated, contested, regionally varied set of changes that move in different directions in different places. But in parts of Western Europe, England, France, parts of the Low Countries, the direction over time was from obligation toward negotiation, from inherited bondage toward a labor relationship that, however unequal, acknowledged some element of agreement between the parties. That subtle shift matters more than it might appear. It introduces the idea that economic relationships can be contractual rather than simply inherited. That idea, once introduced, does not disappear. Medieval trade networks slowly expanded beyond local markets across this period. Merchants traveled between regions, carrying textiles from the Low Countries, grain from the Baltic, metals from Central Europe, spices from the Eastern Mediterranean. Port cities grew in importance. Financial instruments, letters of credit, bills of exchange, partnership agreements developed to make large-scale trade possible without the physical movement of coin. As a poor laborer or craftsman, you do not participate directly in this long-distance trade, but you feel its effects in practical ways. Imported goods appear in local markets that previously offered only what the immediate region produced. Coin circulates more readily. Demand for certain crafts, cloth, metalwork, leather goods rises as the economy becomes more connected. Urban centers become hubs of economic activity that generate their own momentum. Town charters grant limited self-governance. Local councils develop to manage infrastructure, regulate trade, and maintain order. The more commerce expands, the more land alone ceases to define all wealth and power. Universities founded in major cities during the high and late medieval period begin formalizing education in law, medicine, and theology. You are unlikely to attend these institutions. Tuition and literacy requirements place them beyond the reach of most poor families, but their presence gradually alters society in ways that eventually reach even those who never approach their gates. Written contracts become more common. Legal disputes are increasingly recorded and resolved through formal processes rather than purely through the authority of local lords. Administrative systems grow more detailed and sophisticated. States slowly develop bureaucratic capacity that requires trained personnel. That administrative expansion creates new forms of employment: clerks, notaries, record keepers, minor officials, roles that are not strictly tied to land or to inherited status, but require education and reliability. For most poor individuals, access to these roles remains limited in the medieval period, but the range of possible occupations broadens over generations in ways that were not available to your grandparents. Despite all of these gradual shifts, inequality remains pronounced throughout the medieval period and well beyond it. Wealth concentrates among merchant families who control trade networks, among landed elites who retain significant political and economic power, and among powerful guild members who control entry into the most profitable urban trades. Political authority, the ability to make and enforce decisions that affect the community, remains largely restricted to those with property and established status. Poverty does not disappear with economic expansion. If anything, it becomes more visible in urban settings because it concentrates. Rural poverty is distributed across a landscape. Urban poverty gathers in specific neighborhoods, specific streets, specific communities of people who share the condition. Begging becomes a visible feature of city life. Charitable institutions expand in response. Hospitals attached to religious houses, almhouses for the elderly poor, distributions of bread to the hungry by wealthy donors seeking spiritual merit through generosity. Religious orders devote increasing energy and resources to assisting the poor, understanding this as a spiritual obligation. But systemic safety nets in any modern sense do not exist. You still depend primarily on family, guild, or parish. The supports available to you are personal and local and limited. They require you to be known, to belong, to have maintained relationships that give others reason to help. The anonymous poor, those who arrive in a city without connections, who have lost their community through illness or displacement, who fall outside the networks that normally provide support, have very little. Consider the generational dimension of all this. If you manage to secure a skilled trade and accumulate modest savings over decades of careful living, your children inherit more than you did. Not dramatically more, but measurably more. They may receive basic literacy if local parish schools exist, a small but significant advantage. They may be able to enter apprenticeships earlier or under better terms because of the connections and reputation you have built. The small capital of tools or workshop space you leave behind gives them a starting point rather than nothing. If you remain a wage laborer without assets, without a trade, without anything to pass on, your children likely begin in circumstances similar to the ones you began in. This is how social mobility in the Middle Ages operates, slowly, incrementally, and unevenly. It is the accumulation of small adjustments, a slightly improved position here, a modest inheritance there. A child who achieves journeyman status where the parent achieved only day labor. Over centuries, these adjustments accumulate into broader structural changes in who has access to what. But they accumulate slowly, in ways that are invisible to any individual living through them. The Middle Ages are not free from conflict, and conflict complicates everything. Wars between kingdoms, dynastic struggles, local uprisings, and disputes between lords periodically disrupt regions that had been stable. Armies move through territories, and armies need to be fed and supplied. This means requisitioned grain, commandeered livestock, increased taxes to fund campaigns that the peasantry does not choose and does not benefit from. If you are born poor, war is not a distant or romantic affair. It is disruption that arrives at your door in the form of soldiers looking for food, tax collectors arriving more frequently, trade routes closing, and the goods they carry disappearing from markets. Fields may be trampled by armies passing through. Livestock may be taken as supplies. Cities may be besieged, cutting off trade and supply for extended periods. Some poor men join armies voluntarily, for wages, for adventure, or simply because military service offers more certain food than civilian poverty during particularly difficult times. Others are conscripted with little choice. Most endure the consequences of military conflict without having any influence over its causes or outcomes. Conflict reinforces how little control you possess over the large-scale events that shape your life. You did not choose the war, you did not choose the Lord who starts it, or the king who demands it. You absorb its effects because you have no choice. And yet, even war contributes indirectly to change, reshaping borders, redistributing land following defeat, altering economic flows when old trade routes close and new ones open. The consequences of conflict extend well beyond the fighting itself. Religion remains central throughout your entire life, not as a background feature, but as the primary framework through which existence is interpreted. But repeated crises, famine, plague, war arriving in sequence or combination, test collective confidence in ways that cannot be entirely absorbed by existing frameworks. Some people respond with deeper devotion. When everything else proves uncertain, faith becomes more urgent. Pilgrimages increase, churches are built and expanded, donations to religious institutions rise. Others question quietly. In private thought, in conversations conducted carefully with trusted companions, questions arise that do not have comfortable answers. Why did God permit this? What does it mean that the devout and the impious died in equal numbers? Why does prayer, offered sincerely and repeatedly, produce no visible result? Religious institutions themselves change over time in the later medieval period. Reform movements emerge, movements that call for greater simplicity, for the church to return to its spiritual roots, for the gap between official doctrine and lived practice to be addressed. Some of these movements are absorbed into institutional structures. Others generate conflict. For you, whatever your private thoughts, faith continues to structure daily routine in practical ways. Church bells still mark the hours. Feast days still interrupt labor and provide occasion for community gathering. Community rituals, baptisms, marriages, funerals still carry the weight of shared meaning. The parish remains the organizational unit around which social life is structured. Even as economic systems shift and political structures evolve, belief offers continuity in a world that does not provide much of it through any other channel. If you reach old age, you will not experience your life as a story of historical transition. You will remember specific things. The winter, when the grain ran out 3 weeks before spring. The summer, a neighboring family lost 3 children to fever within a month of each other. The morning you walked through the city gate for the first time and stood still long enough that people had to walk around you. The afternoon, you finished your first piece of work that a master examined and called adequate. You will measure your life not in political milestones, but in harvests, in apprenticeships, in marriages, in the births and deaths of children and grandchildren and neighbors, in the accumulation of winters survived, in the slow wearing of your body into the shape of the work it has always done. You will have worked almost every day of your adult life. You will not think of yourself as living through a transitional era. You will think of yourself as living a life, the way people always think of their lives, as the only life, the real life, the one that matters in the way that present experience always matters more than historical abstraction. But historians, centuries later, will look back at your period and see transition. They will recognize that the medieval period slowly gave way to early modern transformations, expanding trade networks, evolving political structures, the development of printing that would spread information at speeds the medieval world could not imagine, gradual shifts toward economies less bound to land and hereditary obligation. And they will note that these changes were built on the labor of ordinary people. People who plowed and planted and harvested and carried and built and wove and hammered and endured. People like you. So what if you were born poor in the Middle Ages? You would not grow up expecting upward mobility as a default assumption. The idea that your children would necessarily have better lives than yours would not structure your thinking. You would hope for their survival, their health, their ability to manage the same challenges you managed. You would not assume education was accessible. You would not imagine that literacy was something you had simply failed to acquire through neglect. It would be, simply, not a thing that people like you did. You would not anticipate retirement security, public health infrastructure, or any of the institutional protections that modern life has built up slowly over centuries of collective effort. Your life would revolve around physical labor, community obligation, and seasonal cycles that you would feel in your body as much as know in your mind. You would experience hunger, illness, and vulnerability more directly than most people in the developed world do today. Not as dramatic crisis, but as the ordinary background condition of existence. But you would also know tight-knit community bonds of a kind that modern life, for all its advantages, has in many ways lost. You would know what it means to belong to a specific place and a specific community in a way that is not chosen and not provisional. You would share festivals with people you have known your entire life. You would grieve and celebrate with them. You would understand yourself as part of something that extends backward and forward in time, through your parents and their parents, and your children and theirs. Your identity would be rooted in land, in trade, in parish, in family. It would have a solidity and a specificity that is genuinely different from the more fluid, more portable, more optional identities that modernity makes possible. From a modern perspective, the constraints feel severe. From within that world, they would feel ordinary. They would feel like the shape of life itself, the way the particular shape of your own life, whatever it is, feels to you now. And that distinction matters, because it reminds us that human expectation adapts to the environment it inhabits, that what feels like deprivation from outside can feel like normalcy from within, that the standards by which a life is judged adequate or inadequate are themselves historical. They change across time, and the changes are neither simple improvements nor simple losses. When we imagine the Middle Ages, we tend to picture castles and kings, the dramatic architecture, the armored knights, the rulers whose decisions fill the history books. But the medieval world was sustained by peasants and laborers, by the people whose names do not appear in chronicles, and whose daily lives left few written records. They plowed fields that fed cities. They built the cathedrals that still stand. They forged the tools that made agriculture and craft possible. They raised children who gradually, over generations, produced the population and the labor capacity and the accumulated practical knowledge that made later developments possible. They endured famine and recovered from it. They endured plague and rebuilt after it. They maintained continuity through instability in ways that required extraordinary collective resilience even as they appeared, from a distance, merely ordinary. Without them, no kingdom would function. No trade network would operate. No city would expand. If you were born poor in the Middle Ages, your life would not likely be recorded in chronicles or preserved in archives. But it would matter. Not because it was dramatic. Not because it carried the kind of heroism that stories celebrate. But because it was persistent. Because it was one thread in a fabric woven from millions of such threads, each one necessary to the whole. History is not shaped only by the people who make decisions that get written down. It is shaped by repetition, by daily labor, by the generational endurance of ordinary people living ordinary lives under extraordinary constraints. As the Minecraft sun sets over fields that regenerate each season, the cycle becomes visible in a different way. Plant, harvest, repair, endure winter, begin again. That repetition defined medieval poverty. It was not a trap that everyone was equally conscious of inhabiting. It was the texture of life itself, the way existence felt from the inside, season after season, year after year. And from that repetition, over centuries, emerged a world where mobility slowly increased, where institutions grew more complex, where expectations shifted in ways that would have been incomprehensible to the people who lived before the shift. The people who lived through it did not see the full arc. They lived inside its foundation. If you were born poor in the Middle Ages, your life would be constrained in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from where we stand. It would be uncertain in ways that would never entirely resolve. It would be demanding in ways that would mark your body and shape your thinking, and define the horizon of what you imagined was possible. And it would quietly, incrementally, without recognition or record, contribute to the long transformation that shaped the modern world. Not through any single action, not through any dramatic choice, but through the accumulation of days lived as fully as circumstances permitted. Through the persistence of ordinary people in an ordinary world, doing what was required, surviving what arrived, and passing on to their children whatever small advantages they managed to secure. That is what it would have meant to be born poor in the Middle Ages. Not a story of heroes or villains. Not a lesson designed for modern audiences. Just a life, difficult and full and brief and quietly consequential, like all lives are.